Hey everyone, my name is Venusha Buwaneka. I'm a junior at Northview High School and I'm here with my partner, Renee Kanda. Today, we're going to give you an introduction to psychology. We hope you enjoy!
Socrates and Plato were both great philosophers in their time, known for their unparalleled influence. Plato was Socrates' student, and while the pair have made great contributions to many parts of science, they are also acknowledged for their involvement with psychology. The two had created and developed an idea on how we gain knowledge about the human soul.
Socrates and Plato both believed that the mind, soul, and consciousness is separate from the body, and it continues on even after the body has left this earth and is deceased. They both believed knowledge was innate, that we as humans were born with the knowledge, and they did not accept the idea that we gain knowledge through experience.
Another very well-known Greek philosopher was Aristotle. However, he had a separate viewpoint on the soul and how knowledge was gained. That same belief challenged Socrates and Plato's.
Aristotle disagreed with Socrates and Plato. He believed that the mind, soul, and consciousness is interconnected with the body. He believed that knowledge was received through experience, and as we grow up and mature, we gain more knowledge.
Descartes, an Enlightenment thinker, agreed more with Socrates and Plato. He believed that the mind, soul, and consciousness are separate and believed that knowledge is innate. As an Enlightenment thinker and a pioneer, he wondered how our mind and body work and communicated. He thought there was a spirit that flowed within all of us. Today, it's known as neuroscience.
John Locke, who you may have heard of from your US history class, agreed with Aristotle. He believed knowledge was gained with experience, and humans have to learn things. He introduced the concept of tabula rasa, which is the belief that the mind is a blank slate at birth, and we are formed and developed from our own experiences with the environment.
Francis Bacon, an English philosopher, focused on how it's human nature to make order of random events. This leads to the discussion of superstitions like knocking on wood. As humans, we take action to make order of chaos. Bacon is also known for stimulating the rise of experimental science and was involved in the scientific revolution and the making of the scientific method.
The beliefs and contribution of both John Locke and Francis Bacon created and developed a theory that would change psychology forever. That concept was known as empiricism.
The era of philosophical thinking transformed into the age of empiricism. Empiricism turns philosophical thinking into a more concrete science and states that knowledge comes from experience. Thanks to Bacon and Locke, their ideas helped form empiricism. Because of science, we rely on observations and experience. Therefore, we cannot just think. We also need science to back up our arguments, especially through observations and experiments.
Wilhelm Wundt is credited to be the father of psychology. He was a strong proponent of empiricism and credited for completing the first psychological experiment. He wanted to examine sensation and perception. For his experiment, participants were asked to press a button when they heard a ball drop. He expected the results of this lab to show a time lag between hearing something and responding to it.
Structuralism versus functionalism. Structuralism, which was supported by psychologists Wundt and Titchener, utilizes introspection, or looking inward, to reveal the structure of the human mind and reveals the what. On the other hand, functionalism, which was supported by psychologist William James, focuses more on how mental and behavioral processes function and cares more about how people adapt, survive, or even don't, similar to the principles of Darwinism.
The list here contains psychological connections that result in psychologists being critical thinkers. Critical thinking is thinking that does not blindly accept arguments and conclusions, but rather examines them. Critical thinkers assess the source of arguments, discern hidden values, evaluate evidence, and assess conclusions. I'm sure we've all experienced this at many points in our life. Overconfidence is our tendency to overestimate our ability to perform a task successfully. We tend to think we know more than we do. For example, if I asked you how confident you were on your answers to a true and false test, most of you would say you were going to get more correct than you actually would. That's our overconfidence at play.
Next, we have hindsight. Hindsight bias, as seen in Taylor Swift's song I Knew You Were Trouble, is the tendency to believe, after learning an outcome, that one would have foreseen it, like how Swift sings, I knew it all along. When watching sports or a movie, do you ever feel like you could have predicted what would have happened? This is the hindsight bias at play. We've included a link to Taylor Swift's song that you can view to get a better idea of hindsight.
Please watch the first 30 seconds of the video linked. It should be in the description for this video. So the illusory correlation is the perception of a relationship where none exists. It helps explain our superstitions. When we notice random coincidences, we may forget that they are random and instead see them as correlated, easily deceiving ourselves by seeing what is not actually there. We are likely to notice and recall instances that confirm our belief and ignore evidence since we are sensitive to dramatic or unusual events. We are especially likely to remember the occurrence of two events in sequence. Example would be a student who believes using a certain pencil will get him a good grade. Although the pencil itself doesn't cause a good grade, illusory correlation causes him or her to believe that the pencil is a lucky pencil and for that reason use that pencil in all tests and quizzes.
The next few slides will contain context and concepts regarding psychological perspectives. The following concepts will relate to the question, why would a student sleep or skip class?
Here are 4 psychological perspectives. There are 9 in total, but we'll go through the other 5 later. For now, let's focus on the biological, evolutionary, behavior genetics, and psychodynamic perspectives.
The neuroscience or biological perspective explains why a person is who they are. It emphasizes that those internal aspects of an individual are far more important than their actions. For example, this includes their genetics. It can be determined by their body, like their nervous system, or their brain structure and its chemicals, like the levels of serotonin or dopamine, which are neurotransmitters. This perspective would suggest that the class is being held in the middle of the day, when, like most people, the student tends to take a nap. Or perhaps the student has a sleeping disorder like sleep apnea, where you stop breathing periodically in your sleep. Or even the student may have damaged their frontal lobe, which is the area of the brain that deals with decision making.
Viewing this issue through an evolutionary perspective, we'd recall concepts of natural selection, survival of the fittest, and Darwinism. This perspective believes that our personalities and individual differences have evolved to provide us with some form of adaptive advantage in the context of survival and reproduction. This perspective would suggest that the student was skipping class due to either family emergencies, helping their species survive, or the student had so little sleep that they're mentally exhausted, which is a sickness.
The behavior genetics perspective focuses on the genetic and environmental influences that affect our behavior. It is related to the nature versus nurture connection we discussed earlier. This perspective would suggest that it's usually the student's time to sleep when the class starts, affecting their circadian rhythm or their internal sleep clock. Or perhaps the student is bored and they really just wish to sleep, which is seen in our culture.
The psychodynamic and psychoanalytic perspective explains personality in terms of unconscious psychological processes. They focus on concepts such as unconsciousness, repressed memories, and struggling conflicts, and believe that childhood drives current behavior. This perspective would suggest that the student who's sleeping or skipping class is doing so because they know they won't do well on a test and are scared of failure, or they have had a traumatic event where they might have failed in the past and the class or teacher, or maybe both, made fun of them.
We will now continue on with the next 4 perspectives: the behavioral, cognitive, social, cultural, and humanistic perspectives. Notice how there are few similarities between these 4 and the ones we just discussed.
This perspective focuses on understanding and explaining human behavior. It seeks to learn how we learn and think to act in certain ways, and would suggest that the student learned to skip or sleep in class.
The Cognitive perspective is the study of our mental processes or how we think of the situation. This involves how we think, our mental processes, how we interpret the situation, our memories, how we problem solve, and how we communicate. This perspective would suggest that the student already understands the material. Therefore, they may think going to class is stupid or pointless.
The socio-cultural perspective focuses on nurture, environment, culture, and norms. They study how in certain situations you act one way according to one culture, while in another culture you'd act a different way. And they also study what is acceptable in different cultures. A good example of a differentiation between cultures is how in America you can hold your thumb up and that means good job, but in another country that might not be the case. A thumbs up might insult someone. They would suggest that an unacceptable behavior norm is throwing a table at the teacher when bored. The more acceptable alternative is to skip class, which is why the student is doing so.
The humanistic perspective is the study of the self. It emphasizes the study of the whole person and focuses on our personal growth, our need to be loved, accepted, and achieving our best self. This perspective would suggest that the student may think they will fail the course, and therefore that person will need more acceptance. They have low self-esteem.
The last approach we're going to look at is the biopsychosocial approach. It's the most unique, but sometimes the most difficult to understand. This approach is a combination of the biological, cognitive, and socio-cultural perspectives.
The biological perspective would suggest that the student has a sleep disorder like sleep apnea.
The cognitive component is that the student believes that no matter what they do, they will fail the exam.
And socially, when one thinks they will fail or is bored in class, society has dictated that it's acceptable to sleep. Hopefully, by the end of this presentation, you will know more about psychology's influential figures, how psychology has transformed over the years, and the different connections and perspectives of psychology. Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something new today about psychology.